The views and opinions expressed here are those of the guests and are not the official position of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
One of the most remarkable aspects of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is its unique history. Throughout the world, great stories from faithful church members have only added to that history. This program shares some of these incredible stories of faith, perseverance, hope, and inspiration. You're listening to Legacy. I'm your host, Nathan Wright. From the Doctrine and Covenants, section 101, verses 86 through 89, we read, "Let them importune at the feet of the judge. And if he heed them not, let them importune at the feet of the governor. And if the governor heed them not, let them importune at the feet of the president. And if the president heed them not, then will the Lord arise and come forth out of his hiding place, and in his fury vex the nation." We have today with us Ronald Barney and Jeffrey Cannon. Ron is a historian of the Church History Department, a series and volume editor of the Joseph Smith Papers, and executive producer of the television series The Joseph Smith Papers. And Jeff is a document specialist overseeing transcription and document control for the Joseph Smith Papers project. And today we're talking about Joseph Smith's visit to Washington, D.C. To begin with, let's just have you two tell us a little bit more about yourself and why you're here to discuss this subject today. Ron, go ahead, please.
Well, I've been involved with the Joseph Smith Papers, the study of Joseph Smith, for about a dozen years. Initially working to prepare a collection of Joseph Smith's teachings and writings for the curriculum committee that prepared the manual for Priesthood and Relief Society that the church used in 2008 and 2009. And that just kind of conveniently dovetailed into the reinvigoration of the Joseph Smith Papers, something that had been initiated by the Venerable Dean Jesse back in the 1960s. And in that Joseph Smith Papers, not only will there be a continuation of all of Joseph Smith's diaries, but there will be a document series that will involve the correspondence, the minutes of meetings, revelations, sermons of Joseph Smith. This particular incident that we're going to talk about today falls in the 5th volume of those documents. Volume 5 will comprise 1839 and 1840. And of course, there's sufficient background for this that it makes it a larger story than just an incident in Washington in the late fall and winter of 1839 and 1840. So my involvement is as one of the volume editors of Documents 5.
Very good. Thank you. Jeff Cannon.
I was hired in the spring of 2002. Actually, at that time, the Papers Project was split between staff that were up here in Salt Lake working in the church office building before we moved into our new church history library, and some of the staff that were down at BYU at the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute for Latter-day Saint History. And at that time, I was hired as a part-time archives employee who was assigned down at BYU part-time while I was finishing my undergraduate degree at BYU. And not long after I started, I came across an assignment to collect some of these documents involving Joseph's trip to Washington. And that has been obviously a very interesting assignment and has been part of the work that I have done since that time, collecting a bit here and there since the initial push that was there at the beginning. And since that time, working on that project a little bit here and there, and as well as the other assignments that I have with, you mentioned document control and transcription. We have literally thousands of Joseph Smith documents in the Joseph Smith Papers that we need to keep track of. And some of the more interesting ones are these documents dealing with Joseph's trip to Washington. Unfortunately, there aren't a whole lot, so there are some holes in the story, but we've tried to plug some of those holes with as much information as we can find.
Good. I appreciate you both being here. The background for the scripture that I read in from the 101st section of the Doctrine and Covenants is, of course, the redress of the saints for the wrongs done in Missouri. And so the prophet Joseph and a delegation goes back to Washington. Ron, give us a kind of a background on what the political and social climates of the time were in Washington specifically.
Well, of course, the country was less than a century old in a very apparent way, and we were just starting to move out of our adolescence into really being a country. And while we had survived the separation from our mother country, and it established a constitution and laws. There were states. There was continuing debate between the role of the federal government and the role of state governments. And, of course, that was an issue even today. Well, in the 19th century, that became even more important as we were addressing the entire litany of issues regarding the role of government in the lives of the citizens. And the Latter-day Saints, while we had difficulties in New York because the Latter-day Saints were not well received, moving the body of the church as it existed at that time to Ohio, and then later from Ohio to Missouri, there was never an issue of the role of government per se until we got into Missouri. And after a bad experience in 1833 in Jackson County, Missouri, wherein our press, in effect, the mouth of the church was destroyed on July 20th, 1833, and finally an eviction notice given in November of 1833, which prompted the textual piece that you read from section 101 in the middle of December of 1833. There was clearly a matter of shouldn't there be something done on the part of government? We just can't take this upon ourselves. So beginning in late 1833, the Latter-day Saints petitioned the government of the state of Missouri for redress over the displacement of the Latter-day Saints from Missouri at that period of time. That continued on into the early part of 1834, a petition to the federal government that something's not right out here and we need some help because individuals or collections of individuals cannot obtain redress through battle or even a war of words in many cases. There has to be some intercession on the part of a government, be it state or federal. And that sort of died away once the Latter-day Saints left Missouri. At least left Jackson County, Missouri, moved north into Clay County. And then later, when Caldwell County was set aside for the gathering of the saints in the late 1830s, the Mormons became an issue again, finally culminating in the extermination order issued by Lilburn W. Boggs in October of 1838. And, of course, that preceded Joseph Smith's incarceration first in Independence, Missouri, then Richmond, Missouri, and finally in the Liberty Jail over the winter of 1839 and 1840. That trauma from our removal from Missouri, of course, brought about another series of petitions, first to the state of Missouri and then to the federal government. Pamphlets were published. This was not something done in the quiet. We believed the very existence of the church was in peril. This was no small issue, and which kind of set the precedent for a delegation to Washington after everything else was exhausted.
So did Brother Joseph just decide to go all by himself? He says, okay, I'm going to go try to make a difference here. How did it come about within the church for him to go? Jeffrey.
Well, it's not just Joseph deciding to go out of the middle of nowhere. Sidney Rigdon's released from jail several months before Joseph Smith is, and Sidney Rigdon was appointed by a conference of the church on the 5th of May in 1839 to be the one who's spearheading this effort, and is the only functioning member of the First Presidency, really, at that point. He's really directing all of this work, and he is collecting all of the information that he can, but he's also dealing with some of the government officials. He's collecting some of letters of recommendation so that he can go to Washington, and people will recognize that this is somebody who is not just some bumpkin from the middle of nowhere. There are people who are vouching for him. There are people who are saying this is an important cause, and this is our official representative for these thousands of people who have been displaced. And he actually comes up with some interesting ideas as to how he's going to do this. The United States Constitution guarantees to every state what in the Constitution is called a republican government, a republican form of government. And Rigdon's idea at one stage was to write to the various states in the United States and ask that their legislatures request their senators, because remember, at this time, United States senators are not elected directly by the people. They're elected by the legislatures of the states. And so there's some control that the state legislatures have over their senators. And they were to instruct their senators and to request the representatives who were directly elected by the people to deny Missouri's congressional delegation their seats in Congress. And by doing this would raise the issue in the federal government. Well, that didn't happen. But by the time Joseph is released from jail, Sidney Rigdon has not gone to Washington. And in fact, he is appointed to be the church's representative in Washington, D.C. That happens in 1839, that he's selected to do that. And he's selected not only with Sidney Rigdon, but Elias Higbee, who was one of the prominent members of the church at the time. And they are the ones who are to be the church's official voice in Washington, and they are to go out to Washington. And it's not just Joseph Smith, that it is this official delegation.
Which sounds like it was approved and voted on by church members. Is that sort of how it happened?
Yes.
Sort of like common consent, what we do these days?
Yes, they were the church's representatives in every way, that they had been by common consent selected to be the voice of the people.
Very good. Any others in the delegation that we know of?
At one point, we have Porter Rockwell as part of that delegation to go. And because Sidney Rigdon is suffering from the after effects of malaria, Robert Foster, who is a physician, is picked up along the way in Illinois to be part of the company that's traveling to take care of Sidney Rigdon. 11 days after the party begins, Sidney Rigdon decides that he is actually too ill to continue on, and he stays behind. And all of those letters of recommendation that he has collected over the past few months, he endorses over to Joseph Smith as the church's representative in Washington. So the company expands and contracts as it goes along and as the situation requires.
This is Legacy on the Mormon Channel. We're visiting today with Jeff Cannon and Ron Barney. This wasn't just a 2-hour jaunt from Illinois back east to Washington. How long did it take them to get there?
They leave at the very end of October, and exactly a month later, they have an interview. The day after they arrive in Washington, on the 28th of November, the day after that arrival, on the 29th, they have a meeting with Martin Van Buren. And that the ease of convenience of getting in to see the President of the United States the day following their arrival there raises a question as to whether or not they had an appointment. One of the reasons that Joseph Smith left Sidney Rigdon in Ohio after they had traveled the national road and they were around the Dayton area, as I recall, when when Sidney says, I just can't go on, and instead of Joseph staying, which would have been very characteristic of him, and tending to Sidney Rigdon until he recovered sufficiently to get there, Joseph Smith says, we've got to go. So he leaves with just Judge Higbee. And Judge Higbee, who had been a judge in Caldwell County, Missouri, and because he died in 1843, has kind of fallen off the map for us. But at the time, he was very important, and that he would be a part of this delegation is certainly wouldn't have been a surprise to any Latter-day Saints at the time. So it takes them a month, after some delays here and there, before they were finally able to get to Washington.
During that month, there's an account of Brother Higbee describing an incident with a stagecoach during this traverse. Can you relate that to us before we get to Washington? Jeff?
We have, as Ron says, they're traveling along the National Road, which is a very popular road for people to travel across. The railroads are not quite all the way, between Commerce, Illinois, where they are, and Washington, D.C., so that's not an option. They're traveling by stagecoach. And the stagecoaches of the time very commonly travel along what's now what was called the National Road. And this is one of the most widely known incidents from this adventure. Joseph is in the stagecoach, and towards the end of November, the stagecoach driver pulls over to the side of the road and stops at a tavern. And while he's there, the horses become spooked, and they take off running. And there's a bit of panic inside the stagecoach. There's one of the accounts says that there was a woman who was about to throw her infant child from the window of the stagecoach, thinking that it would be safer to throw the child out than to let the child stay on the coach, which may fall off the side of the hill, because they're in an area which is basically a ravine, and the road is just along the side, and it falls several hundred feet from the side of the road. And so the woman is about to throw her child out. Joseph convinces her that that's not a good idea, and climbs out of the stagecoach and
not unlike John Wayne would do in the early 1950s.
Yes, in this very John Wayne-like moment of Joseph Smith's life, he crawls from the stagecoach and pulls the horses to a stop. And the horses were described as having gone about 3 miles in this episode. Joseph actually at this point is traveling incognito. He's using the name Wallace. And some of the people, when they've heard of this, say, well, if Joseph Smith could perform a miracle like that, then I would be more inclined to believe his religion. And just kind of out of nowhere this comes, and Joseph Smith, I'm sure, kind of got a little bit of enjoyment out of that idea.
One of the interesting features of this story is the way that it was told. I'm going to depart a little bit from the chronology that we're discussing here to talk about the issue of sources. Jeff mentioned earlier there's kind of a vacuous space here regarding primary sources to help us to understand all of this, including exactly what Joseph Smith's motives were. We kind of extrapolate from the experiences of Missouri that after petitioning local government that we must go to the federal government. And we make some determinations about what likely was the reason that he went there, but we don't have a diary account from him. We learn later on that he has charged Robert Foster, who was just a young man in his 20s, who had probably recently joined the church, and when they picked him up in Springfield, Illinois, and Joseph Smith had charged him with keeping a record of what they were going to do, and he failed to do that at the time. Joseph later on even mentioned that Robert Foster, who interesting later on turns out to be one of the principals in the final demise of Joseph Smith. He and his brother were advocates of Joseph's incarceration in the aftermath of the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor, which ultimately led to Joseph Smith's incarceration in the Carthage jail. But at this time, Foster, who was a fairly young convert who had some background in medicine, demonstrating some knowledge of English and of communication, was charged to produce something, and he didn't. In 1874, however, he did produce an account of this incident that we've just described. He couched it in a way that one would think he was sitting right adjacent to Joseph Smith in the stagecoach when it happened. But he had stayed behind in Ohio. So only Joseph and Elias Higbee were in the stagecoach. But Robert Foster, based on whatever, but there's a chance he could have become aware of Elias Higbee's letter that was written from Washington on November 5th, within just December 5th, within just a short period of time after the incident took place. He may have had access to that and expanded and embellished the story some. It gets to the heart of one of the real difficulties about this. Not only do we have Robert Foster's account to contend with, which is not an eyewitness account, but we don't have anything from Joseph Smith during this period of time. Elias Higbee, from Washington, once they get there at the very end of November, writes 2 letters back to Nauvoo. And then once Joseph Smith leaves Elias's side in January of 1840, Elias writes 6 more letters to Joseph Smith. So 8 letters altogether, nothing from Joseph Smith, nothing at all. If we would have had the detail that Joseph Smith's journal had for the period of September of 1835 to the spring of 1836, it would have undoubtedly been rich with detail about what happened, rather than us having to hang on these fragments and shards that came later on regarding the incident. So sources is a real big deal. We don't have as many as we would like, to be sure. What we do have, though, helps us to flesh out, I think, the story in a way that makes it manageable and allows us, to a degree, to speak with some definition about what likely happened. But there are a number of unknowables, and there are still some questions that remain to be answered in the absence of some of this primary documentation.
Since the prophet was such a good diary keeper, normally, do we have any idea why it didn't happen during this trip? Was it his desire for anonymity, or?
Well, I think that there is the illusion that Joseph Smith was a great diary keeper, but if you were to look at his journals, you would find a series of starts and stops where Joseph becomes, I think, feeling somewhat guilty that he is not keeping a better record, and he begins a journal only to a couple of weeks later stop. And the largest portions of his journal where we do have a continuous record are not written by Joseph Smith himself, but through a series of scribes. And so, as Ron says, we don't have a whole lot directly from Joseph Smith. Everything is filtered through a scribe of some sort.
And that's perhaps why he was relying on the Foster to take care of that. Correct. For this trip.
That is standard operating procedure for Joseph Smith, that he would rely on clerks or somebody else to keep the record under his direction, but not under his thumb.
So when a modern traveler gets to Washington, D.C., they see lots of different things, lots of interesting sites and monuments and other places that we're all familiar with. What do we know that the prophet saw when he stepped into D.C.?
Well, the Washington, D.C. today intentionally has a sort of old look to it, but that is really more glass and mirrors than anything else. A lot of those buildings, although they have a sort of neoclassical design to them, are 20th century buildings. The buildings that Joseph Smith would see is a much smaller United States Capitol, a somewhat smaller but certainly recognizable White House, and several temporary buildings that would have been there at the time, which are no longer there. The first day that they're there, we know that from the letter that Elias Higbee sent back, they spent a lot of the day looking for a place to stay. And where they did find is in a place which is now occupied by the National Art Gallery on Missouri Street, which has been moved. And so if you were to go to Missouri Street today in Washington, D.C., it would be several miles from where Joseph Smith actually stayed at the time. So the Washington, D.C. of Joseph Smith's time was not the Washington, D.C. of today. It was not the impressive capital that we see today, although there were several very large and impressive buildings. Joseph describes the White House as being very large and spacious and having a nice fence around the property, and it would have been impressive to Joseph Smith coming from the area that he had come from. And he describes going up to see the President of the United States, and I believe he calls it his splendid parlor, if those are the words that come to mind, and meeting with him in that environment. And Ron, did you want to talk about that particular meeting? I think you've got...
Let me retreat a little bit. By the 1830s, there had been a number of people who had written observations about Washington, D.C. Americans weren't necessarily very proud of this setting for the seat of government. There was a man by the name of Francis Grund. He was Viennese-born, somewhat contemporary to Joseph Smith. He visited Washington, D.C., and left a description that was probably not too far off from what Joseph saw. I'm going to read just two paragraphs from Francis Grund's book, an interesting book, by the way, called Aristocracy in America. And it was written to play off Alexis Tocqueville's volume, Democracy in America. So he played off of some of the things that Tocqueville mentioned that characterized America and Americans in a way to show that there was yet another side to be described, which he called aristocracy in America. Remember, this is a man from Vienna who had been in the United States for about a decade. He said the approach to the metropolis, speaking of Washington, D.C., is anything but striking. Washington is indeed a city sui generis, of which no European who has not actually seen it can form an adequate idea. Now, that was not a compliment, and anybody who knew the period would know that. Mr. Serrulier, formerly Minister of France, used to call it a city of magnificent distances. But though this be true, I should rather call it a city without streets. The Capitol, a magnificent palace situated on an eminence called Capitol Hill, and the White House, the dwelling of the President, are the only two specimens of architecture in the whole town, the rest being mere hovels, and even the public buildings such as the Treasury, War, and Navy departments, and the General Post Office, little superior to the most ordinary dwelling houses in Europe. The whole town is, in fact, but an appendix to those two public buildings, a sort of antechamber, either to the Capitol or to the house of the Chief Magistrate. If such a town were situated in Europe, one could imagine those buildings to be residences of princes and the rest of the humble dwellings of the dependents. Well, he goes on and describes Washington in a greater detail. And it would probably be fair to say that Joseph Smith, like Francis Grund, was equally underwhelmed by Washington, D.C., and perhaps what he had anticipated when he went there. Not only was the setting disappointing, but then, of course, the aftermath of that setting was was very much a disappointment to Joseph Smith.
And as part of that, here's another quote. So this is the day after they've arrived. On Friday morning, November 29th, we proceeded to the house of the president. We found a very large and splendid palace surrounded with a splendid enclosure decorated with all the fineries and elegancies of this world. We went to the door and requested to see the president. So we've made reference to that before, but was it that easy to get in to see Martin Van Buren?
Well, we know about Andrew Jackson's presidency that the White House became something that it hadn't been before. This man of the people from Tennessee almost had an open door policy, and it proved disastrous. And Martin Van Buren from New York, Old Kinderhook as they called him, because his residence later on was at Kinderhook, New York. Martin Van Buren was described by some as being kind of a dandy. He was single at the time. His wife had died earlier. He was fairly regal in the way that he did business. He was a considerate man. He was diplomatic in the ways that he did things. He had felt like the presidency was rightfully his because of the contribution that he had made to the political environment of America, and indeed he was Andrew Jackson's successor. But there was a congressman from the state of Illinois who it almost appears had been anticipating a visit from Joseph Smith or a delegation of Latter-day Saints to Washington, and this congressman, whose name was John Reynolds, he had been elected as the governor of Illinois in 1830 and then resigned in 1834 to run for Congress and was elected. And it was John Reynolds, we learned from a memoir that he wrote in 1855, who introduced Joseph Smith and Elias Higbee to President Martin Van Buren in the Executive Mansion. We know very little about that event other than what Higbee says about it, and then just a little snippet of what John Reynolds writes 16 years after the fact about his part in that significant meeting.
You're listening to Legacy on the Mormon Channel, and we're visiting today with Ron Barney and Jeff Cannon. I think most members of the church have heard at least one of the quotes that is associated with that. Will you just describe as much as we know about that meeting and what was said? Jeff? As
Ron mentioned, we do have this account from Reynolds discussing this meeting, and we also have in the letters that Joseph and Elias Higbee sent back their description. These are the two primary sources that we have. Obviously, the Smith-Higbee letter being closer to the time period. If we go at this chronologically as to the way this actually unfolded, we have a bit of the kind of pre-meeting between the three of them before they go in. And Ron, do you have that to read, or did you want to recount that? Because I think this is an interesting insight to the way this all unfolded and the way that this happened.
John Reynolds in 1855 is part of this. It's really a very interesting tome. In December 1839, the prophet Joseph Smith appeared at Washington City and presented his claims to Congress for relief for the losses he and the Mormons sustained in Missouri at the City of the Far West. When the prophet reached the city of Washington, he desired to be presented to President Van Buren. I had received letters as well as the other Democratic members of Congress that Smith was a very important character in Illinois, and to give him the civilities and attention that was due him. He stood at the time fair and honorable as far as we knew at the city of Washington, except his fanaticism on religion. The sympathies of the people were in his favor. It fell to my lot to introduce him to the president, and one morning the prophet Smith and I called at the White House to see the chief magistrate. When we were about to enter the apartment of Mr. Van Buren, the prophet asked me to introduce him as a Latter-day Saint. It was so unexpected and so strange to me that I could scarcely believe he would urge such nonsense on this occasion to the President. But he repeated the request when I asked him if I understood him. I introduced him as a Latter-day Saint, which made the President smile.
Was that a smile of amusement, or any thoughts on that?
I think that Reynolds tells the story in a way that he was trying to portray that the president was somewhat amused by this idea of being Latter-day Saints. And it's a phrase which I think most Latter-day Saints today, and maybe even somewhat at the time, think of as not really that out of the ordinary, but to someone coming at this phraseology cold, or somebody who is looking at it from the outside, I think it would be an interesting idea, these saints in a latter time period, in an environment where people think of saints as being more first century Christians than 19th, 20th, or 21st century religionists as they are today. So I think that there was sort of this idea that Reynolds was trying to portray, that the president found this idea amusing in his smile. And to hear the account from Joseph Smith and Elias Higbee in their letters, the tone is somewhat different. I don't think they were amused by the situation at all. They arrived and they met with the president, and as they tell it, they turned over their letters of recommendation, which they had been collecting and Sidney Rigdon had been collecting, and had been signed over to Joseph Smith. And specifically with the letter from Thomas Carlin, who was the governor of Illinois, we hear that the president looked at it and kind of repeated this name questioningly in his mind, Thomas Carlin, kind of trying to remember who this person is, and finally saying, I don't know this Thomas Carlin. Who's Thomas Carlin is the words that we have. And then after reading a few of these letters, he finally gives this quote that many of us are familiar with. What can I do? I can do nothing for you. If I do anything, I shall come in contact with the whole state of Missouri. And there are two versions of this quote. We hear that version, and we also hear the "Gentlemen, your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you" version of the quote. And the first one we have from the letter from Higbee and Joseph Smith. The second one, the earliest reference we have, are from the rough draft notes for the history of the church, which was compiled somewhat later. And if there is a source for that, it's been lost to history.
Is there any evidence that the reason there are two different quotes is that there may have been two meetings?
There's some ambiguity about this, but I think circumstantially there is evidence that there was more than one meeting. This meeting, the initial meeting, took place the 29th of November, 1839. Once Elias and Joseph Smith met with President Van Buren, their main ambition, their main occupation was to try to influence the Congress, the 26th Congress, to mount some type of momentum that Congress would intercede and help the Latter-day Saints in Missouri. In fact, the early descriptions of their trip to Washington said they were going to appeal to Congress. It wasn't we're going to appeal to the President of the United States. We're going to go to Congress. They viewed Congress as the point that they might get some traction. And indeed, December and January, they tried to lobby Congress, and there was a sympathetic Illinois delegation led by Senator Richard M. Young, who had been a judge in Illinois, and clearly Richard M. Young had tried to be a voice for the Latter-day Saints. It is apparent that he had sympathy toward what the Saints had gone through, as many Illinoisans had viewed what had happened in Missouri as being an outrage in a land where freedom and rights were vouchsafed as some of the most important features of this country. The fact that we don't have a very clear definition if there were one or two visits is, we think, in all likelihood because of the absence of a detailed chronology of what took place. Once Sidney Rigdon got to Washington in the middle of December, he followed up a couple of weeks later. The references to the meeting with Martin Van Buren that for what is likely the second visit include Sidney Rigdon. In the first meeting, as described in Hiram Smith's, or the letter from Elias Higbee to Hiram Smith on the 5th of December, 1839, Joseph and Elias do not walk away from the White House believing that they had no chance. In fact, the president, according to Elias Higbee, said he would give some consideration to what they had said. We learn later on, after Joseph Smith returned to Nauvoo in the late winter of 1840, based upon several reports that we get, newspaper reports and even accounts of a sermon that he gave, that, as one newspaper reporter stated, apparently in the middle of this second interview, President Van Buren, who had previously said, "I'll give this some consideration," just stood up and left the room and left them sitting there, which Joseph Smith took as a great personal insult. So instead of the chief executive of the United States giving some sympathetic listening to Joseph over a period of 2 months, Van Buren had made up his mind that he was not going to give any kind of credence or heed to the appeal that Joseph had given him, because the Mormons were nothing. There were many other issues on Martin Van Buren's mind. His address to Congress, which took place just 3 days after the initial meeting with Joseph Smith and Elias Higbee, was all about especially Indian incidences and about what he called the horrible circumstance of the removal of the Cherokees from the South to their eventual circumstance in Oklahoma, across the Mississippi River, part of all the strategy of Indian removal in the country. And Martin Van Buren's pet project, which was a national treasury. In the aftermath of the failures of the First and Second National Bank, there had to be some type of stability brought in to make the monetary circumstance of America manageable. And that was Martin Van Buren's primary effort, and he would be content to have it to be his primary legacy. On top of all of that, Martin Van Buren, if he was anything, was a states' rights advocate. He did not want to provoke the South and had gone so far as to try to distance himself from any issue that would have created an environment where the federal government had to confront any state government. And that's exactly what Joseph Smith and the delegation was trying to get him to do. It would have been the last thing that he would have done to step in on the part of the Latter-day Saints. His entire reputation, his entire political career had been based upon this premise of states' rights, instead of the unthinkable prospect of a sectional conflict that would bring the country to odds that, of course, not that many years after, within a score of years, bring about the Civil War. So the circumstance of Joseph Smith in Washington, both of the visits, the appeal to the delegation in Illinois that in turn took upon themselves the voice of the Latter-day Saints to try to sway Congress. And then there was the fact that it was the Missouri delegation, Senators Benton and Representative Lynn, who stepped in and quashed any type of effort that the Illinois delegation tried to raise by saying it wasn't the state of Missouri's fault, it was the Mormons themselves. And they read from a hearing where Joseph Smith had to endure, as it were, the accusations of former Latter-day Saints about the role of the Latter-day Saints in the difficult circumstances of northern Missouri. And the Missouri delegation used the witnesses, the former Latter-day Saint witnesses, as the indictment against Joseph Smith that eventually caused the Judiciary Committee to say, we don't have an issue here that we need to become involved in.
And if I may, there's a quote, another John Reynolds quote in your chapter concerning that very thing. John Reynolds explains the reversal in Joseph's view in light of both the President and Congress. His claim for damages done to the Mormons in Missouri was submitted to the Senate, and both the senators of Missouri, Benton and Lynn, attacked his petition with such force and violence that it could obtain scarcely a decent burial. Smith returned to the state of Illinois a red-hot Whig, which I guess that's the other political party. And can you explain to me maybe what the leanings of the Latter-day Saints were politically in those days, and perhaps why Reynolds would have said that?
Well, the political situation is certainly one that is one that needs to be considered in all of this. And the Democratic Party that we know today is not the Democratic Party of the time, and that's something that we need to understand, and that there is a Whig Party operating as well. And the Democratic Party was seen as being somewhat of the dominant party in Illinois. And that both parties, of course, were vying for this large Latter-day Saint block of votes, which they perceived as existing. And if they could get some loyalty from the Latter-day Saints in Illinois, then they felt they could sway some of those elections. So there was, a political reason for anybody who is not a Latter-day Saint to be dealing with the situation.
One of the things we might say here about the appeal of the Democrats to the Latter-day Saints, and this is a generalization, to be sure, but the church was born in the age of Jackson, and Jacksonian democracy, especially on the frontier, had enormous appeal. President Jackson was making an argument about America that his predecessors had never made, and there was an enormous appeal to the rank and file of the country about this man who was going to intercede. The federal government was going to intercede on behalf of local residents, and this had some appeal to the Latter-day Saints. There had never been a platform created prior to that time by the Latter-day Saints about what their political leanings were. There had been no effort made that we would be uniform in our practice or our ideology politically. One of the things that the Whigs were very big on was internal improvements, canals, railroads, transportation, to try to build the infrastructure of America that would make accessible to the people in the westernmost parts of the country the same kinds of things that were enjoyed along the eastern seaboard. So both parties had an enormous appeal, but it was the Democratic Party that was the states' rights advocate. It was the Democratic Party that maintained the posture, we do not want to disrupt the sectional differences that we have in America right now, which slavery, of course, was a part of it. You had almost at this very same time the first abolitionist elected to Congress. So the slavery issue was very vivid to these people, and it was not taken lightly.
So the delegation was there for some weeks. Did they make any impressions on the locals, on any of the other political leaders at the time? Do we know?
We know that at one point, as Ron mentioned, actually, that Joseph returned to Washington. He just kind of said that in passing. There were a couple of weeks where Joseph actually left Washington, went to Philadelphia, was in New Jersey for a time, visiting some of those branches there. And when he returned, we know that he did give some public discourses which were reported in newspapers, which looked upon him and reported about him quite favorably. So there is reference to him being there by other people that we are aware of. And obviously we know that Reynolds included the incident in his memoirs. But there is not a huge... like we've said before, there is not a huge body of documentary evidence for what was actually going on. We don't have a minute-by-minute chronology of his actions and movements.
There is one incident where he spoke to a group of people in Washington, and I believe the date was February the 5th, and a journalist from New York was there, and wrote a report of this in a letter to his wife in New York City. It just happens to be one of the most important encapsulations of what Joseph Smith was thinking at the time. In some way, we do not know how, we ended up with the original of the letter. And it may have come into possession of the church in the 1840s, so that it was transported when the saints transported it to the Great Basin, when the Latter-day Saints came here themselves. This is a very, very significant letter. It has been republished in the history of the church. It shows the kinds of things that Joseph thought were important. There is a characterization of him as a human being, as him as an orator, or the lack of his ability as a fiery speaker, but certainly represents the sincerity and the earnest nature of Joseph Smith. And this man said he was totally disarmed by hearing Joseph Smith speak, and expressed that surprise to his wife. And it's a wonderful portrayal of what was on Joseph Smith's mind at the time, and that he was not antagonistic, that he tried to represent the Latter-day Saint point of view in a way that would not estrange us from other Americans, and would provide some traction. It doesn't appear that it was ever published anywhere else, nor was there necessarily an intention for it to be published. But my guess is that some Latter-day Saint missionaries were in New York, and somehow this letter, which was sent to his wife Mary, would ended up in the hand of some Latter-day Saint missionary, perhaps, or some other way, and it ended up in possession of the church. But it's really a very, very important document, and one of the few that we have about what Joseph Smith thought at the time.
You said that the main reason for the delegation going to Washington was to address Congress, to go before them to try to make the situation better. Why do we put so much weight on the encounter with President Van Buren if that was sort of almost secondary, it seems, to what the mission was?
I think there is a tendency in people's minds, especially today, to think of the president as being a very powerful person, and any sort of meeting with the president is then newsworthy for an organization. Anytime the president of the church meets with the president of the United States, it's all over the church news. And at the time, Congress was seen as a very powerful institution. The framers of the United States Constitution intentionally gave a lot of power to the legislative branch of government. And if you look at the constitutions of some of the original states, their legislatures are far more powerful than the legislatures of states which came into the Union later on. And in those states, their executive is much less powerful than the more powerful executives in Western states of this country. And I think that it's a better story. It's more easily told than the more long, drawn-out process of legislation. When I was an undergraduate student, it was often repeated, a maxim: there are two things in the world you don't ever want to see when they're being made. One of them is sausage, and the other one is laws. And the reason for that is it can be a very ugly process, and it's not an interesting process that people really want to talk about.
One final John Reynolds quote that I'd like to read from this chapter of the book. He says, "No one can foretell the destiny of this sect, and it would be blasphemy at this day to compare its founder to the Savior, but nevertheless it may become veritable history in 1,000 years that the standing and character of Joseph Smith as a prophet may rank equal to any of the prophets who have preceded him." He may not have accomplished what they went to do as far as redress for wrongs in Missouri, but it seems like he did make an impression while he was there.
I think that is definitely the case, and this was not the last attempt. He didn't go home and say, well, that's all finished, so we'll never petition the government again, because the Latter-day Saints continued to petition the government. It served as maybe in some ways the prelude to Joseph Smith running for the presidency in the spring of 1844, which of course was abbreviated because of his murder. I'd just like to make one little statement here that might seem like might give maybe some surrounding understanding of Joseph Smith going to Washington. If it is the case that Martin Van Buren was a states' rights advocate who it would have been so out of his character and would have almost been unthinkable for him to have interceded on behalf of the Latter-day Saints. If the Latter-day Saints were not naive and somewhat informed, and we believe that they were, very clearly from the periodicals of the church, they were looking at world events. One can look at the Times and Seasons, for example, even earlier in Missouri with the Evening and the Morning Star, and world events, national events were reported. These were not people who closed their eyes to what was going on around them. If we believe that with the Latter-day Saints were not naive, and if we believe that what Martin Van Buren's posture regarding states' rights was known to Joseph Smith, then what in the world was he going there? What did he hope to accomplish? I don't think it is unreasonable to believe that, especially in light of Section 101, that one, after being rebuffed by local and state government, that one could go to the presidency and receive a respectable hearing. I don't think it is beyond reason to believe that Joseph Smith anticipated that God would intercede and change the Pharaoh's heart, not unlike Moses' experience with the Pharaoh in Egypt. It may also help explain why Joseph was so outraged at the way that he was treated, expecting Martin Van Buren's heart to be touched, to be softened. And then, and it appeared that maybe that would happen in the aftermath of what was likely the first visit. But with that second visit, where there was nothing but contempt and disregard given to the Latter-day Saints, no wonder Joseph Smith changed the way that he thought about politics thereafter. Indeed, one could make the case that in the aftermath of his incarceration in Liberty, Missouri, and in the disappointment in his visit to Washington, one can see why he took upon himself, little by little, a larger role of statesman. Politics was something that he spoke about. Rights and the abuse of rights were issues that he addressed. And it is no surprise in light of what happened to the Latter-day Saints, which, as I stated, served as the prelude to his own involvement in national politics.
Thank you very much. This has been a great hour talking with you, gentlemen, about this historic visit of the prophet to Washington, D.C. Ronald Barney and Jeffrey Cannon, thank you very much for being here.
You're welcome.